Even though it seems like the Earth King is in charge of Ba Sing Se in Avatar: The Last Airbender, it's quickly revealed that the true power behind the throne is the Dai Li, the corrupt secret police who ruthlessly control the city and much of the Earth Kingdom. One of the things Avatar did really well for its time was moral complexity. For half of the entire series, we're told Ba Sing Se is this bastion of freedom and resistance facing down against the myriad evils of the Fire Nation, only to reveal the Dai Li as arguably even more intimidating antagonists than the Fire Nation ever were. Not to mention episodes like Zuko alone, where we see the supposed corruption and cruelty within the supposed good guys Earth Kingdom. It's more than just good versus evil, but the different shapes evil can take and how certain kinds of it are much harder to fight. In fact, they beat Fire Lord Ozai in the end, but never actually managed to defeat the Dai Li. This kind of corruption, it seems, is too deeply rooted, and the story uses all of this to explore how authoritarianism comes to be, how corruption works, and how tyrannical systems perpetuate themselves. And these are the 3 questions we're going to be looking at today. This video is sponsored by me, and I'm lucky enough to do that because of you. I love making in-depth educational materials which are freely available to everyone, like my on-writing and world-building series. And if my work has helped you in any way, if you've learned stuff with me, I'd love you to join the Patreon and Discord, or pick up my on-writing and world-building series, which takes all those discussions and puts them into these books, which are even better. Follow the QR code on screen or the link down in the description below. People often think of authoritarianism as limited to dictatorships, but that's not true. I mean, we have to say it. History is complicated. Authoritarianism is a style of politics or governance which certain models of government are more or less compatible with. All governments are somewhere on this spectrum. Governance which is oppressive and has a disdain and disregard for human rights. Now, the Dai Li's corruption is especially surprising considering it was founded by none other than Avatar Kyoshi herself, the Avatar who is meant to be this paragon of good in the world. But we have to understand the Earth Kingdom's political environment that led to all of this. Corruption and authoritarianism never arises in a vacuum. The Earth Kingdom may look like a single united country in all the pretty maps like the Fire Nation, but in reality it's more like 55 semi-independent states who regularly fight amongst themselves. Rebellions, border skirmishes, people throwing a hissy fit. If there's one thing Earth Kingdom history is rife with, it's not unity, it's chaos. The Yellowneck Rebellion, Chin the Conqueror, the Dao Fei, they all threaten to tear the Earth Kingdom apart at various points. Not to mention the royal court itself in Ba Sing Se is regularly full of backstabbing aristocrats who all trying to get closer to the throne, Game of Thrones style, culminating in things like the Wars of Secrets and Daggers right before Kyoshi became the Avatar. To call it a stable and unified kingdom is to stretch the definition of the words. And the problem is, unstable political environments like this are fertile ground for authoritarianism and corruption. Authoritarianism presenting itself as a solution and corruption as a natural fault in a broken system. And this was ultimately the Dai Li's downfall. After Avatar Kyoshi passed, not only would the Earth Kingdom become more unstable, with factions looking to fill the power vacuum she left behind, but the Dai Li themselves would look especially more vulnerable without their leader, their founder, an easy target for other factions in the imperial courts. Despite being founded as an organization to supposedly preserve and protect the Earth Kingdom's cultural heritage, the constant competition and need to protect their own influence inside the court slowly corrupted them, meaning they spend less effort on actually preserving Earth Kingdom culture and more in becoming a deadly secret police institution. See, the problem is authoritarianism is fundamentally inefficient, not just because they tend to over-centralize authority and struggle to respond to their people's wishes, but because the people in power have to pour more resources into taking power and keeping it instead of actually trying to govern. And we see this all the time with authoritarian systems in our world, resources poured into bribery, over-militarization, repression of opposition, and all of this gives birth to low-trust systems, where institutions and factions within the government are working against each other and even themselves, making it difficult for the government to carry out complex initiatives, and also for populations inside these states to trust the economy and institutions of society, worsening pre-existing problems. Institutions in these societies have fundamentally warped incentives because you cannot govern if you're afraid of a knife in your back. And this manifested in the story of the Dai Li in what became known as the Night of the Silenced Sages. See, one of the other powerful factions within the Earth Kingdom at the time were the Earth Sages. Have you heard of them? No, you wouldn't have, because they're dead. Similar to the Fire Sages we meet in the series, they're these semi-spiritual, sort of bureaucratic officials who helped run the government at the time. It was actually an Earth Sage called Jianzhu who basically ran the Earth Kingdom for decades before Kyoshi came to power, ruthlessly suppressing rebellions, controlling a massive spy network, having a huge influence over the Earth King, and an iron grip on legislation within the Earth Kingdom. In fact, we know the Earth Sages were really concerned with who was going to be able to raise the Avatar when they came around, because the Avatar was going to be a powerful ally. It was all political maneuvering, but in that, they became a dangerous rival to the Dai Li, having this immense influence over the royal family. The Earth King at the time, seeing their rising influence, ordered the sages to be rounded up by the Dai Li and given a choice: bend the knee or die. Only a few survived the ordeal, and those who did were heavily monitored, stripped of influence, and isolated from each other. It's the good old authoritarian tactic we've just seen in Turkey: arrest your immediate opposition just before they can do anything to your grip on power. But, and stay with me here, we're going to put a little bit of a tinfoil hat on. If we read between the lines, the Dai Li didn't just purge the Earth Sages out of mindless loyalty to the crown. They did it because it eliminated one of their rivals and solidified their own power. One fewer political rivals to contend with in the circles of power, not to mention, where the Earth Sages were spread out and numerous, the Earth King was one guy and perhaps easier to control. So, with the Earth Sages gone, the Dai Li could also fill those important roles in government ministries the Earth Sages once occupied. Suddenly, this created a power dynamic where the crown was even more reliant on the Dai Li for their authority, setting the stage for them to chip away at their final rival, the monarch themselves. And look what happens by the time Aang rolls around in The Last Airbender. They've neutralized the Earth King entirely and taken his power for themselves. See, a hallmark of authoritarianism is the death of political pluralism. Pluralism is where multiple factions with different interests and priorities can still work healthily within the same government. I should say that political pluralism isn't limited to democracies, to parties working together. Monarchies still have to account for things like the church, for the gentry, the merchant class, for the aristocrats. Monarchs were very rarely, if ever, absolute rulers, but authoritarianism tries to chip away at that, to forcefully remove opposition, delegitimize them, otherwise neutralize them, paint their participation in the circles of politics as unnecessary, ineffectual, even traitorous. These patterns play out all the time in our world, and this is exactly what we see in the Earth Kingdom. The Dai Li remove opposition and concentrate power in their own hands. Part of this can be the death of the separation of powers or of the influence of the constitution. Now, it's not mentioned in the series, but the Earth Kingdom actually did have a constitution. It was a constitutional monarchy, and the Dai Li worked with the Earth King to undermine it, to concentrate further power in the hands of the crown, of the executive, power which they knew and planned would eventually flow to them. A fundamental tenet in the growth of authoritarianism is continuously modifying the rules of the game to benefit the people in power, make it harder to remove them, make it more difficult for other factions to gain a foothold, and importantly, to legitimize more authoritarian governance. That's why these people tend to attack things like the Constitution. This is also, they can point to the broad powers of the Constitution or this legislation, and they can go, I have the powers to do this and you can't stop me, the courts can't stop me, or at least they muddy the waters so much that everything gets caught up in legal argument and debate for so long that no one can even stop them doing anything. It's too late. It becomes this, oh, who really knows if they were allowed to do that, to the point that them doing it again just becomes normalized. And although the Earth Kingdom doesn't have a separation of powers in the modern sense, we do see the Dai Li blurring the limits and rules of executive power to make it harder to question authority. And this sort of politicking has its basis in history and the present. Sadly, the sages and the Dai Li are, in part, inspired by the literati class in Imperial China, these educated elites who wielded huge amounts of power inside the Imperial Chinese bureaucracy, sometimes even more so than the emperor themselves, and these factions of whom would sometimes purge their opposition as they vied for power. And the world today is facing a wave of democratic backsliding, as authoritarian movements in modern democracies gain momentum primarily by undermining political pluralism and opposition, by casting doubt on the electoral process, weakening checks and balances, widening executive power, weakening the judiciary, and utilizing geopolitical chaos to concentrate power in their hands, with the argument that they are the saviors of their nation, fighting against some kind of evil without and within, Authoritarians, especially ones who are working inside modern democracies, will often try to maintain the sense of legitimacy. They might tear the system and the rules apart to concentrate power, but maintain the sense that they are the true representative of the people, that that's where their power comes from. Attacks on nebulous groups like the media, as if they represent some sort of cohesive ideology, are attempts to delegitimize criticism and paint themselves as the sole arbiters of truth. You don't need to listen to the argument if you can just ignore the source. And with this, a distinct part of that transition towards authoritarianism is the normalization of corruption. This is where first, institutions are slowly broken down so that corruption rarely gets prosecuted or it's prosecuted unequally, especially to further blur the lines of legitimate executive power, and secondly, corruption becomes essential to how the system works. It becomes a fundamental part of the exchange and flow of power and goods. Everyone is corrupt and everyone needs to be corrupt. It becomes this built-in, often invisible cost. At best, corruption accusations become a tool to wield against political opponents. In fact, during the Night of the Silent Sages, the Earth Sages were almost definitely accused of corruption, of being traitors, of undermining the Earth Kingdom. Interestingly, corruption normalization is actually really well documented in modern-day China, where low wages for public officials on a local level means bribery has become a bit of a standard practice in local government, with some estimates saying it might account for up to 3% of GDP. That's 718 billion Canadian dollars or 10 trillion Mexican pesos. And Rise of Kyoshi actually describes this sort of thing as becoming a pretty common part of Earth Kingdom bureaucracy. Out there is an entire nation crammed full of corrupt, incompetent people who will try to use the avatar for their own purposes, buffoons who call themselves sages, when all it takes in the Earth Kingdom is having the right connections and paying enough gold to plaster such a title on your brow. As the Dai Li took over the Earth Kingdom bureaucracy, that corruption continued under them, just to serve them. Again, corruption weakens institutions because people working there have a greater incentive to enrich themselves rather than do their job. Especially if they need the money, it distracts them from doing their job. And it's because of all of this that corruption and authoritarianism are deeply intertwined, reinforcing each other. Authoritarianism sustains itself through corruption, and corruption prevents more democratic and efficient modes of governance from getting a foothold. Both corruption and authoritarianism manifest in what are called patronage networks, where government resources are distributed in part to ensure loyalty and consolidate power, rather than because of where they really need to be. A lot of this will often go to the military or lower level officials. And we actually know the Earth King and the Dai Li did this. After a series of tsunamis hit the southern coast of the Earth Kingdom, the Earth King at the time offered aid, but only conditional on them traveling to work on the outer wall of Ba Sing Se, basically dragging in workforce and power and influence, which in turn increased Ba Sing Se's federal influence over the other states. And when you see Long Feng and the Dai Li this way, the Avatar didn't just represent a threat to his power, but he was someone outside the Dai Li's patronage network with still significant influence. Someone unwilling to be brought into the corruption ring will sometimes be singled out or held back on authoritarian systems because they might represent a threat. To be clear, this isn't always true. Authoritarianism and corruption are both really complicated topics. Like, Singapore is somewhat authoritarian, but it actually has one of the lowest corruption rates in the world, and there are complicated reasons for that. And in speaking about Belarus, an authoritarian state, researcher Marina Zeleznaya spoke about a really interesting quirk of corruption there. While political loyalty is an important mediator of the effect authoritarianism has on corruption, the government deprived politically disloyal organizations of corruption opportunities instead of using corruption as an incentive to promote political loyalty. So it's not always about rewarding loyalty. One really interesting tidbit of Avatar's world building here is that you can see a cycle at play throughout its world history, that authoritarianism rises when the Avatar isn't around. In fact, this is pretty explicit in The Avatar and the Fire Lord, where Sozin refuses to save Roku because, quote, "without you, all my plans are suddenly possible." I don't think it's a coincidence that the Night of the Silent Sages happened in the power vacuum following Avatar Kyoshi's death, and how the Dai Li truly take power from the Earth King and solidify their control only when Roku is gone and Aang isn't around. The Dai Li's concentration of power was made easier when the Earth King also died suspiciously read between the lines, and the New Earth King was, oh look at that, luckily only 4 years old, nice and ripe to be molded from a young age by Long Feng himself. Although I had a funny thought when researching this video where you can look at the Avatar as kind of like the ultimate authoritarian who just turns up and says, this is how things are gonna be, especially Kyoshi. But, of course, everything changed
when the Fire Nation attacked.
The 100-Year War presented the Dai Li with an opportunity to cultivate even greater power. Fear of war and starvation, a victim narrative to exploit, the chaos of the influx of refugees, the weakening of the outer states like Omashu, general instability justified even greater purges, even more Orwellian laws under the guise of national security and solidarity, protecting civilization, saving the country. Authoritarianism usually relies on some kind of emotional appeal as being the necessary evil to tackle bigger problems, war, instability, civil unrest, and it'll go back to normal when, of course, things are fine, but things are never fine, apparently. If this sounds familiar, it's because it is not new. It's happening today, and it's happened all throughout history. During World War II, the UK suppressed news of the war through the Ministry of Information. You might not know this, but George Orwell actually made propaganda for the British government, and that work partly inspired 1984. News or failures from the front were often suppressed or spun to be better, the argument being that censorship prevented any publications which might endanger the troops or expose a country's weaknesses, but it was clearly also used to suppress criticism of the government and help politicians hold on to power. The Axis powers were even more brutal with this, more censorious, so much so that the German people kind of barely understood just how poorly the war was going for them a lot of the time. A country divided during wartime can easily get caught up in infighting instead of winning the war. It can lead to a loss of morale and support, and it's just chaos. Something the Dai Li would have necessarily been worried about, leading to their "there is no war in Ba Sing Se" policy. But this kind of unstable wartime political environment and these laws are easily exploited for corrupt purposes. Those in power able to further imprison opposition, concentrate power under the guise of them threatening national security, that emotional appeal being channeled into painting someone else as the enemy, both without and within. And the Dai Li did exactly that. People who might undermine the peace and stability, the haven that is Ba Sing Se. Even the highest ranking generals knew not to criticize them. This was how empires fell. And actually, if you want to learn more about how empires rise and work and fall, then volume 1 of my On Writing and Word Building series has 3 whole chapters on it with way more depth than I can ever fit on YouTube. Or if you want to learn about how revolutions really work, then On Writing and Word Building volume 3, which is even bigger and more in depth and way better, and it's my favorite volume. Or if you want to learn about writing elemental magic systems or creating civilizations, not to mention a ton of other topics, all unique to each of these books. But all of this goes to show another fundamental tenet of authoritarianism: control of information. Manipulating information available to the public about world affairs, the economy, the state of their own country allows authoritarianisms to keep a hold of power and suppress rebellious sentiment, even disseminating favorable narratives to create the illusion of legitimacy. And if they can't dismantle the free press, then they might instead try to delegitimize them, label them as liars, and paint themselves as the only source of truth. In fact, Long Feng we know as the Grand Secretariat, based on a real position in the Imperial Chinese government, powerful primarily because they controlled which information went to the emperor himself, often manipulating it for their own benefit or simply suppressing news they didn't want to pass on. The Earth Sages definitely controlled where information went and who to, and when that bureaucracy passed to the Dai Li, that power did as well, only entrenched during the 100-Year War. Again, authoritarians will rarely paint themselves as authoritarian by nature, but instead the savior of the people, right? That's the narrative they'll want to sell and control. They'll often use their control of information streams to further the destruction of pluralism, painting their opposition as traitors or servants of that hidden or outside evil which only their authoritarianism can confront. You can only trust them, and authoritarianism is the price we pay. And of course, how can we talk about their control of information and people and the whole system that built up without talking about Lake Laogai? We learned dissidents were imprisoned or even brainwashed. Lake Laogai was actually based on a real network of prison camps in Maoist China, the Laogai system, meaning reform through labor. There was also the Laozhao system, which meant re-education through labor. They were slightly different, but it's also worth noting here the Dai Li were partly named after the leader of the Blue Shirt Society, a fascist organization under Chiang Kai-shek, who regularly assassinated and imprisoned his opponents. They were inspired by multiple things, all of which were authoritarian, the most important thing here being an over-reliance on punishment. Authoritarian movements generally advocate for harsher punishments over rehabilitation, even the death sentence. To them, fear is an important tool just as much as punishment is. It justifies more extreme powers, it undermines checks and balances and constitutional protections. They use arguments like, oh, you're against these terrible methods? Oh, you must be pro the rebels or murderers or whatever. This too is a hallmark of democratic backsliding today, often coupled with a narrative that the country is at risk and only harsher punishments and fewer restrictions on law enforcement can root out the enemy within. We don't see the Dai Li pushing this narrative specifically, but interestingly we do see it with Kuvira later on, who, of course, also paints other people as enemies of that hidden and outside evil which only authoritarianism can confront. But with this, their claim to power was complete. They were the de facto rulers of the Earth Kingdom. But this drags us to another question. When authoritarianism manages to remove all opposition, if they accomplish their goals, what then? Indoctrination, to guard against opposition in the future. This is another part of them controlling information, controlling the narrative about themselves, their history, the threats the country faces. While the Dai Li were originally volunteers who wanted to serve the Earth Kingdom, Long Feng started them taking children off the street and training them up from a young age, trapping them in a social system where they had a place, power, influence, and which they were trained to serve in obedience, not only entrenching their power, but trying to guard against infighting in the future. After all, without an enemy they can unite against, authoritarianisms will often resort to infighting. All of this is why one of the best moments in the series is when Long Feng tells the Dai Li to arrest Azula, and they don't. They join her, backstabbing him.
Dai Li, arrest the Fire Nation princess.
It's because they haven't made up their minds, she said. They're waiting to see how this is going to end. The fact is, they don't know which one of us is going to be sitting on that throne, and which one of us is going to be bowing down. Because ultimately, a lot of authoritarian systems, not all, but a lot of them are inherently fragile. The normalization of corruption creates easy breakpoints and it's a system with backstabbing built into it. Authoritarians often have to resort to necessarily pitting their lessers against each other, which really doesn't help. Just as much as authoritarianism is inherently inefficient, it can also be inherently self-destructive, eating away at itself. This is not to say that they cannot last for a long time, but that while democracy can seem inefficient and slow, its greatest strength is that it has a built-in mechanism to accommodate radical change. You can vote people out. There's an easy way for the people inside and outside the political structure to implement changes without breaking the system as a whole. How power is transferred, which is when systems are most vulnerable, is clear and easy. There are rules. This is why authoritarianism often starts by attacking or muddying the electoral process. You have to instill a lack of faith in the system before you can entirely break it. Authoritarianism doesn't offer that easy transfer of power. It's built to resist change and is often centered around a few people like Long Feng, without whom it just breaks. And that self-destructive tendency can be transferred to whoever is in power next. We see that with Azula, who, funnily enough, banishes the Dai Li because they've already betrayed Long Feng. Why wouldn't they betray her? Like, I get it, she was kind of losing her marbles there, but she was kind of right. Corruption perpetuates, but also encourages the disintegration of the next regime, and ultimately, that's why Aang couldn't put an end to the Dai Li the way he did Fire Lord Ozai, because it's a system, not a person. The real world is complicated, it is difficult, it requires tireless, conscious effort from everyone to ensure it is heading in the right direction. And with the way the world is currently heading, we need more of that than ever. We need to understand how authoritarianism works before we can stop it. I love Avatar, I've loved it for a long time. I don't only talk about it, but I do like talking about it. I love its magic system, I love its world, and storytelling is a passion of mine, as it may well be yours, and I'm really happy that I get to make freely accessible, open, in-depth educational stuff online, you know, that everyone has access to kind of learn. I think that's important. That's how I started my channel. I hope you think it's important too. Sometimes I do this in videos like my writing and world building series. Sometimes it's videos like this where I use like Avatar or a different story to kind of explore interesting topics. But I'm only able to do that because of my supporters on Patreon, because of the people who get my books. I mean, they are just a huge amount of my job now. It's really quite incredible. And I want to say thank you to everyone who has.
And I've actually got a whole other video you can watch right now over on Patreon where I talk about how food is a world-building superpower, and I talk about Avatar in that one too. It's actually one of my favorite videos I've made in a long time.
Or if you want to learn more, then my On Writing a World Building series takes all of the discussions we've had about fiction, storytelling, and puts them into these easier to read, easier to reference books, which all work together, and they have way more depth and analysis and detail than I could ever justify putting on YouTube. You know, I have to be conscious of the algorithm and stuff like that. I don't have to with these. These are better, and I'm so proud of them, and 100,000 other people have already got on them. I think you should too. By the way, all 3 volumes are entirely separate, cover different topics, so you can get the ones which cover the topics you're interested in, although I recommend getting them all. Thank you so much. I only get to make videos where I don't take sponsors like this because of you, because of the people who get these books, who support me on Patreon. It really does mean the world, and I'm so happy that I get to create stuff like this for you, that you are interested in learning about stuff, as I love learning about stuff too. Stay nerdy, stay vigilant, and I will see you in the future.